His hand is leading me. Though the world pass me by, go their way, let me be. Just to walk with him means everything to me. Just to walk with him means everything to me. Just to know he's there, his hand is leading me. Though the world pass me by, go their way, let me be. Just to walk with him means everything to me. Just to walk with him means everything to me. Just to know he's there, his hand is leading me. Though the world pass me by, go their way, let me be. Just to walk with him means everything to me. Praise the Lord, everyone. You may be seated. Our lesson today is titled, A God of Justice. And we are going to start reading in Micah chapter 6, starting at verse 6. And it says, Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He hath shown thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. So Mike is asking the question here, what shall I bring to God? Shall I bring some extravagant sacrifice? Shall I make a show of an offering to God? Is that sufficient to cover all of the shortcomings that I may have? And the resounding answer is no. God isn't looking for us to come with some display of a sacrifice. Instead, he's looking for us to come with a sacrificial heart, giving of ourselves, giving what God is looking for. In Samuel, it says, to hearken is better than sacrifice. To obey the voice of God is better than a sacrifice. That's what God isn't looking for us to come with some ostentatious display of giving to try to make up for shortcomings in other areas. He's looking for us to come with a sacrificial heart, to give ourselves, saying, God, your word says that I need to do this, and so that's what I'm going to do. He wasn't coming with thousands of rams as a sacrifice to say, God, if you'll just ignore all of the things that I disobey in your word, I'll bring this instead. Isn't that sufficient? Or if I sacrifice 10,000, he says, 10,000 rivers of oil, will that be sufficient to make up for all of the other things that I lack in? And no, God isn't looking for that. He is looking for me to sacrifice my will to him, to surrender myself and be the servant he wants me to be. That I would love mercy. That's a tough one. Loving mercy is a tough one. I want mercy for me, but I want judgment for you. That's the way we are. I deserve God's mercy, but you not so much. And that's not what God is looking for. He's looking for that I will be merciful as well, that I will seek after mercy for you and goodness for you, not just for what it does for me. And then we will read from Mark as well. And we find that in this lesson, it presents a different picture than what we tend to think of when we think of Jesus. And they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast them out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations a house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves. Wow. On that unforgettable day, Jesus seemed to be everywhere at once. He was flipping over tables and benches, leaving a trail of chaos. Men shouted in surprise and anger as they clawed at the air, desperately trying to recapture doves Jesus had freed from their cages. The money changers crawled and grasped at the coins scattered across the floor, trying to keep their profits from rolling out of sight. Temple life had not always been this way. At one time, sacrifices were sold and money exchanged at the markets on the Mount of Olives. But the high priest Caiaphas, responding to pressure from Jewish leaders, granted permission for these markets to be relocated to the court of the Gentiles in the temple. Overnight, a place that had been dedicated to prayer and worship was transformed into a shopping center. Gentile worshipers were crowded out by greedy merchants, and the Jewish leaders seemed to be all right with this. In their eyes, these Gentile interlopers were unfit to set foot on the temple precincts anyway. Jesus was furious. My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, quoting Isaiah 56:7. He looked around him, eyeing the money changers and merchants who were glaring at him with malicious expressions. Ye have made it a den of thieves. In Mark 11:17. Thoughts? Comments? When you read this, what thought comes to mind? What do you think about this? Anybody? No thoughts at all? It is imperative that we remember to keep the main thing the main thing. And that should be our worship to God. Yes, we understand that sometimes, it takes finances to run things. But that should not be our primary goal. Our primary goal must be developing people who serve God and teaching them and training them to reach other people to serve God. That must be our primary focus. And when it goes away from that, then there has to be a refocusing. Lord, help us that we keep the priority. We understand that many times reaching people requires finances. And there's an appropriate time to focus on those things. But the number one focus has to be what that purpose is for, and that is to reach people. In ministering to them, in having compassion on people, in strengthening them, lifting them up in whatever capacity that requires, and not being the focus. The focus in the temple here became, it's much easier if we bring the sacrificial animals right to the temple. And people won't have to go through all the drama of transporting it from over there to the temple. It'll be right here. How convenient. We love convenience, don't we? We do. We sometimes say, oh, for the good old days, but there are some things that those good old days weren't so good. There were some things about it that were difficult. But has our desire for convenience taken over our desire for God? Have we made it too easy, and so the idea of sacrifice becomes a little, well, I'd rather not. It's okay if you want to sacrifice, but don't inconvenience me. Lord, help us. The disciples discovered that nothing seemed to make Jesus angrier than the abuse and injustice in the name of religion. They did not realize that their master would soon suffer even worse abuse at the hands of men who believed they were doing God's will. Reverence for holy things would soon become the pretense for the most horrible crime in history, perhaps, the crucifixion of the Son of God. Even a cursory review of the Bible reveals how much God cares about justice. The Hebrew word for justice, mishpat, appears 421 times in the Old Testament and is frequently translated as judgment in the King James Version. Believers should care about justice because God cares about justice. Deuteronomy 32:4 describes the Almighty saying, "All his ways are judgment. A God of truth and without iniquity, right and just is he," in Psalm 146:7 and 9. It elaborates on God's justice by declaring that he upholds the cause of the oppressed. God's justice is demonstrated in his action. Jesus performed many miracles for the benefit of the poor and the oppressed, including widows, those who were sick, and societal outcasts such as lepers. Why do you think Jesus focused so much of his ministry on the poor and needy? And what implications does that have for the church today? Why did Jesus focus so much of his ministry on poor and needy, and what implication does that have for the church today? Mm-hmm. 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 It is definitely easier to reach people like that recognize I have a need. And we can get so comfortable in our situation. Revelation talks about the church of Laodicea, and they said, we're rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing. And God said, you don't recognize how poor and desperate you really are because you've lost that, because God has blessed you, and for lack of a better term, his blessing became a curse. Because we have received so much from God, he's been so good to us, that we forget how much we need him. What we needed him for in the first place was that, God, I had no hope without you. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Yep. Godwin? I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. The implication for us is that, go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. That is a huge impact on us because, again, our blessing has become our curse. God has blessed us so abundantly, and so we depend upon other things. We depend upon our great job. I have a great job, and it'll take care of me. I have great health insurance, and it'll take care of me. And I have this, and I have that, and I have the other, and I depend upon that and I don't have to depend upon God. God help me, because I can easily fail to recognize how much I need God. You are exactly right. I've traveled to Africa, and when you preach to them and you tell them God can, they don't have a great job. They don't have the health insurance. They don't have this and they don't have that I depend upon. And so when I tell them God can, what can it hurt to trust in it? They can't lose anything. They can't have any less than they have already. And so you tell them that God can and will meet their need, and they just believe you. And God answers that belief because he takes that faith in him, and the miraculous is poured out. And we come to God with this attitude of, if God wants to give it to me, he'll meet all my list of, and he'll do it this way. And we limit God because it'll come in this fashion, and this is how it's going to work. And otherwise, I don't think I want to receive it. Go ahead. Yep. Yeah, Jesus could have healed her the first day she was sick. But sometimes it takes us getting to that point of desperation. We don't receive from God at first because let me try this. And that doesn't work. Well, then let me try this. And that doesn't work. And we try the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Guess what? He doesn't have to be the God of last resorts. But frequently he is, because that's where we have to get before we come to the point of desperation that we will trust in God enough, because I've tried everything else. Mm-hmm. 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 I was singing an old song this week, and it says, if you've tried everything and everything's failed, try Jesus. But sometimes that's unfortunately where we have to be. We have to try everything else. And he's waiting there the whole time saying, you could trust in me first. You could come to me first and not put yourself through all of the pain and worry and frustration. But instead, you're a little thick-headed and you think you've got it figured out. So I'll wait for you to get to the end of yourself, and then you can come to me. That's okay. That's okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have one of those friends that I don't call either, but there's a different reason for not calling him. Because it will be 3 hours of me saying, yeah, oh, really? And that's all you will get in. You'll be lucky to get that much in. And so I can't call him because I'm like, I don't have 3 hours for you to just rattle on and on and on, and I can't even say anything yet other than yeah. That I just can't. Anyway, back to this. Jesus focused on his ministry, much of it on the poor and needy, because they recognized their desperation. They didn't have any other options, and so he was able to minister to them. Where those that weren't in that situation, why do I need God? I've got everything. Everything's under control. My life's going very well. Yeah, it's not. You just don't realize yet the desperation that you are in. But it's so much easier to reach someone like that because of their need. The first time I traveled to Africa, we were going to a village that did not have a church. And we had a pastor there in Africa who was willing to go to that village. But understand, this is an agricultural society, and so there's not a lot of money for a pastor to move into a new town and begin a church. How's he going to survive? So what we were doing was we're going to go there, and we're going to spend a week or so getting a church established for him that we can hand over to him with a congregation already in place. And also, at the end of the time, we took up an offering from everybody that came from neighboring churches, basically to pay his rent for a year, to pay facilities for a year, all of that thing, to cover expenses for him, to give him 1 year to get started. Anyway, so a family came from a neighboring town to help us. And this wasn't a pastor. This was just a family that lived in a neighboring town that came over to help out at this, with us starting this new church. There was no hotels in town. We were traveling probably 45 minutes or so to another city where there was a hotel for us. That's being far too generous. The place we stayed, we never had hot water the entire time. I went down. They had a restaurant. They said, I found it very humorous. I went in and they handed me a menu. I said, okay, I'll have this and this. We don't have that. Okay, well, I'll have that and that and that. We don't have that. Finally, I was like, okay, what do you have? We have toast. Got it. So I had toast every single morning for the entire time I was there. That's what they had. Toast was it. So, okay. Anyway, well, this family, they couldn't afford even to stay where we were staying. So they were going from house to house in this little village, asking if anybody has a place they could stay while they were there for this week or week and a half. And they met up with this family that said, yes, we have a room that we would let you stay in. And they told them why they were there. And they said, oh, our grandfather had a stroke 18 months ago, and he's been bedridden since that. Would you pray for him? Sure, we'll pray for him. Now, sometimes we say, I'll pray for you, and that's what we do. We say it, and that's as far as it goes. But instead, Lord, help us. That when we say, I'll pray for you, that it means something, that we'll truly pray, and we will expect that they are going to receive from heaven. So, this family prayed for him. They truly prayed for him. And that day, that night actually, this man who had been bedridden for 18 months comes tottering into the service on a cane, but he's on his feet for the first time in 18 months. And now the people that were gathered there, they knew this man. He lived in their village. They knew he had been bedridden for 18 months. And in the middle of worship, people are singing and praising God. And this man gets up on his feet and makes his way all the way up to the platform that we had set up and laid his cane down, lifted his hands, and began to jump up and down and worship God. Let me tell you, the power of God fell because people saw God in action and they responded in faith. All because somebody didn't just say, I'll pray for him, but instead they truly prayed for him. And they were anticipating, they were expecting that God is going to move. Lord, help us that when we say we're going to pray for you, that it's more than me just saying words coming out of my mouth that I'll pray for you, but instead that I will pray in faith, knowing God is well able to meet that need, no matter what it is. You know, God isn't limited except for by my faith or lack of it. The scripture tells us, according to your faith, be it unto you. What do you believe God for? A crumb? Sometimes we get a crumb because that's more than what we've trusted him for. But God's saying, I want to dump out a whole load upon you, but I need a little bit of faith to work with. I need you to expect and believe that I not only can, but that I will. And watch God begin to move when we come to him with faith. He has proven it to us over and over that when we come to in faith, God shows up. It is the currency that God operates in. You know, we look back at history, and it wasn't that long ago in our history that you could travel somewhere, and if you had a bag of salt, you could trade it for all kinds of things because salt was considered a currency. Everybody needed it. And it wasn't readily available everywhere. Well, faith to God is like that salt. It can be used, and God responds to faith. He is looking for people to come to him in expectation, believing, anticipating, thanking him in advance that God is going to meet my need. I just believe he will. And there are people here that have witnessed that down through the years, God showing up in faith and responding to faith and answering prayer in dramatic fashion. See, I've personally witnessed the deaf lady jump to her feet and say, I can hear, I can hear. I saw that myself. So I know that God can and will. I witnessed the man sitting in the second row fall over. And someone who was on the rescue squad walk over to him and say, his heart isn't beating. And we began to pray. And I watched that man not just sit up, but stand to his feet and begin to worship God. Because God shows up when we show up with faith. God, help us that the things that you have blessed us with doesn't dull us to the possibility of your power showing up. That it doesn't stop us from expecting that you can and will answer prayer. Help me, Lord, that I am not so thick-headed that I depend on me. But instead, as your word says, I cast all my care on you, Lord. Because if you care about it, God cares about it. Okay, back to our lesson. Proverbs 11:1 reads, a false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. While most of us no longer use weights and balances on the job, there is a timeless call for honesty in business. Christians should not participate in any business transaction that knowingly takes advantage of others, especially the poor and needy. Christians who serve in positions of leadership or authority must treat their employees, co-workers, and customers fairly with respect, regardless of circumstances or any personal disagreements or differences that may exist. What does justice look like at your workplace? What does justice look like at your workplace? Sometimes, we can easily find ourselves, depending upon our position, we can find ourselves, that it would be easy to be dishonest, to be unfaithful, untrue. Anybody? Mm-hmm. 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 Anybody else? What does it look like at your workplace? I've told you before, I had a boss that would say, people would call in and want to talk to him, and he was like, just tell him I'm not here. Like, nope, not doing that. You wouldn't do that? No, I wouldn't do that. I said, you want me to lie to you? No, well, then why would you expect that I would lie to somebody else? I will tell them you're not available. I'll tell them you can't answer the phone right now. Anything like that, fine with me. But I'm not going to tell them you're not here if you're here. That's not happening. And finally, he got the message that, okay, that makes sense. I guess I don't want you to lie to me. I guess, so if you're not going to lie to me, then you wouldn't lie to somebody else either for me. As we work toward being Christ-like, it's not just words that come out of our mouth. Oh, I'm a Christian. If it doesn't go beyond that, it's a waste of time. It's what happens when I walk through those doors. Am I Christ-like there? Am I Christ-like to people who don't serve God? Do I treat them the way I would want to be treated? Do I have compassion? Am I honest? Am I just? And even in things that, and maybe it's not a big deal, but some time ago I went to Home Depot and I bought something. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was lumber. And anyway, I told the guy when I went to check out, I have this much. And of course, he checked it and he was like, no, you don't. You have this amount. And it was lower than what I had, that I said. Okay, you counted it. And then when I got home, he was wrong. I did have the amount I thought I did. So the next time I went back, I said, I owe you for additional lumber. I bought it. I knew I had it, and you only charged me for this. I could have kept my mouth shut very easily. But would that have been just? No. I knew what I had. I was sure of it the first time. But after the guy counted, then I questioned myself. I'm like, well, maybe I miscounted. But when I got home and recounted, I'm like, he cheated himself. I don't operate that way. I would expect them to be honest with me, so I need to be honest with them. Now, does that always work? No, sometimes I had an argument at the gas station just a few months ago and finally gave up trying to be fair. Because it's a pump up here that I get diesel at for my tractor, and it's not prepaid. You have to go inside, or I'm sorry, it is prepaid. You have to go inside and pay, though. Well, I had 2 5-gallon tanks. And I forget what it said. I think it was like, whatever. I think it was $3.49 a gallon. So 10 gallon would be $35. And so I gave them $35. I walked back out. I fill the 2 tanks, and the pump only says like $28. Like, that can't be right. This pump isn't working properly. Because when I squeeze the handle, I could hear the diesel coming out into my tank, and the pump still isn't registering. And it took it a while before it finally got started. Something's not right here. So I went back in and told them, your pump isn't working correctly because it only says this amount, but I know I have 2 5-gallon tanks. I got 10 gallon. It's how much it should be. And I argued with them for probably 15 minutes, and I could not convince them that there's a possibility that their pump was malfunctioning. And finally, I'm like, okay, I'll take your word for it, but I know it's not right. Anyway. Sometimes, yeah, that's all I can do. I know it was wrong, but anyway. Lord help us. I would hate to think that I missed heaven over something so trivial as being a cheat, over something so minor. Lord help me, help us, that is in our mind. My goal is to hear him say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. That's more important than anything else. And so help me, Lord, that I always keep that in your mind. That is my goal. Go ahead. We do our best, and that is, and sometimes that is a real challenge. I have worked in places that it was very, very difficult because of whatever. I was one of 4 supervisors at a place that I worked, and the other 3 supervisors were all friends, and they'd go out drinking on Sunday night, and we had a Monday morning meeting every week, and we come into the meeting, and they'd already decided this is what we're going to do. I'm like, well, no. Where's my input into this? No, never mind. We're doing it this way. It made it very, very difficult because we were supposed to get together and decide how things were operated. And the 3 of them already decided what they were doing when they were out on Sunday night. And so when I arrived on Monday morning, they already made a decision how we were going to operate things. Whew. That was a tough one. Lord, help me. Give me wisdom. His word says, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally. Lord, you need to give it to me liberally because I ain't got it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do sometimes. Sometimes my very best attempt to follow you, God, it seems to be roadblocked every way I can go. Help me to know how to go about following after you. Okay. The prophet Micah asked a question many of us have asked. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before the high God? Micah then launched into a list of extravagant offerings and sacrifices, including thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil. Micah asked if God requires us to sacrifice everything, including our firstborn child. These questions, of course, were rhetorical because God doesn't ask us to give what we don't have. None of us have access to 10,000 rivers of oil. And God is not impressed with an outward show of worship and sacrifice that tries to mask the stench of a disobedient heart. Jesus quoted the prophet Isaiah when he said of the religious leaders of the day, this people draweth nigh to me with their mouth and honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they do worship me, in Matthew 15:8-9. Later, in the same gospel, Jesus confronted the Pharisees about their practice of tithing on the herbs they grew in their garden. This fastidious approach to giving may have been commendable, but they were ignoring what Jesus called the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. Personal holiness and morality are important, but they do not excuse a lack of care and concern for others. Sacrifice in one area does not make up for disobedience in another area. Jesus has shown us what is good and what he required. Micah said to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with thy God. God is looking for a pure heart that serves him and others. If we have made good choices in life, they are often the result of biblical teachings we received during our formative years and not from an innate personal goodness. We should remember the words of Jesus in Luke 12:48. Unto whom much is given, of him shall much be required. One of those requirements is showing mercy and grace and compassion to those who have not enjoyed the same blessings we have enjoyed. Our lesson asks us, make a list of blessings you have received because of someone else's sacrifices. How can you sustain that cycle of blessing? Wow. Make a list of blessings you have received because of someone else's sacrifices. As I began to think about that, I began to think of some people that just sacrificed so much. I've told you before, growing up, the pastor that we had, he had graduated from college and was about to start a good job when God called him to move to the mountains and start a church. And he packed up his family and his 2 children and did what God told him. He never had really anything. He was practically poverty-stricken because there wasn't a whole lot of money around. But because of him, I think of the list of people that came to know the Lord because of the sacrifice of that man. Now, a few of you will know Sister Grace Hinkle that goes to the Stanton Church. She's, what is she, 91 now? That was his daughter. She was just 4 years old whenever he decided to pack up his family and move there. Thank you, Lord, for someone who was willing to sacrifice that I could come to know truth. I think of other people there like that, that gave me such a witness of what it means to serve God in the face of difficulty. We've talked about Sister Grace, Grace Bland. Sister Grace had polio when she was small, and so she had one arm that was drawn up like this, and one leg that was several inches shorter, and so she wore this boot that was built up so that she could walk at all. But Sister Grace wanted to be in church. And if nobody had called and said, Sister Grace, we're coming to pick you up, she would start walking down the road from her house to church. Now, it was about 4 miles. There isn't a sidewalk. There's a road that does this around the side of the mountain to get you to the church. So sometimes we'd forget who was, we took turns. You go this week to get Sister Grace, and I'll go next week to get Sister. And sometimes we'd forget to coordinate, and we'd get to church and realize, no one got Sister Grace. And we'd jump in the car and head off, and here'd be Sister Grace coming down the road with her cane. She was going to come to church. It didn't matter that nobody showed up to pick her up. Help me, Lord, that I don't wake up and say, it looks a little nasty out today. I think I'd rather just stay home. If Sister Grace could get out and walk the miles to church, I think I can manage to get in the car and drive here. What a testimony to dedication in serving God. Brother and Sister Tingler, who were some of the very first ones that the pastor baptized when he moved to the mountains. in 1936, Brother and Sister Tingler were some of the very first people. And so when I was a teenager, they were coming to church. But the church wasn't just down the road anymore. They had moved because most of the people had moved out of that area. And so Brother and Sister Tingler had 20-some miles of dirt road before they got to the blacktop, before they got to pavement. But they'd still be at church. Help me, Lord. I get a little frustrated when I have to sit through 3 red lights. What a testimony of faithfulness to God. It's people like that I put on a list of blessings to say they made an example of what it means to be dedicated to serving God. When things don't exactly go the way I want them to, when it's difficult, when I find a situation I don't want to find myself in, that I look at people like that and say, you know what? If they can serve God for 50, 60 years in difficulty, I think I can make it. And I won't, that's not to mention, I've talked about my grandmother so many times, and granddad, my mom's dad, not my dad's. Him coming to church, and, I'm still amazed. He was an alcoholic, and he started coming to church because he came for prayer after he wouldn't heal after surgery. 8 years it hadn't healed. And he came for prayer, and it healed the incision healed in just 2 days. And I still remember Granddad coming into church, and his head is sopping wet, and his whole arm is wet. And I'm like, Granddad, what on earth happened? He said he lived on the other side of the mountain from the church. And he said, it was so foggy on the mountain, I could not see to drive without holding my head out the window. He said, but when I was going to the bar, that would not have kept me home. So I didn't see how it could keep me home from church. So I have a list of blessings like that, of people who live the example, not just words coming out of their mouth, but live the example of true dedication and service to God. Help me, Lord, to ever keep them in my mind, that if they can do that, I think I can sit through 3 red lights. I may be a little impatient about it, but I can do it. Let's stand. We have a 5-minute